Our first scripture passage this morning comes from Ecclesiastes. It's a text that we traditionally attribute to King Solomon the Wise, though most modern scholars would argue otherwise. Regardless, we understand the main character, this teacher or preacher whose name is Keheleth in the Hebrew text, to be quite similar in thought and practice to that ancient king. And it's important context, I think, because it situates these comments about vanity, on the fleeting nature of all mortal deeds, goods, and riches. It situates it on the lips of a person who has been so successful that there were no more challenges to overcome. Alexander wept, for he had no more worlds to conquer, as they say. Now, Keheleth's teaching does not come as a denunciation from someone outside the halls of power. It's a self-reflection on what is actually meaningful once a person has attained all their earthly dreams. It's not an excoriation directed from the restless poor at the entitled rich. It's the meditation of an old man who has worked hard all of his life and yet knows throughout all of it that he remains powerless to prevent pain, frustration, and loss. It's not the prevarication of an unscrupulous fundraiser trying to induce some sort of moralized contribution to the church coffer, though I could use a private jet. No, it's the honest rumination of an elder in the twilight of his years who, looking back on all he has built, sees that there is nothing left to do but leave it all as an inheritance to his successor. One whom he's not quite sure will be a good steward. He's not sure that this inheritor will honor all of the struggle and suffering and sacrifice that went into creating this legacy that is being passed on. I hated all my toil, in which I had toiled under the sun, seeing that I must leave it to my successor, Keheleth laments. Who knows whether he will be wise or foolish? Yet he will be master of all, for which I toiled and used my wisdom under the sun. And yet another example of how the Bible seems to remain eerily relevant to modern day life. Human nature is the same, after all, more than 2.5 millennia later. But in an echo, in 1996, Thomas Stanley released the groundbreaking study, The Millionaire Next Door. And it contained research that consistently showed that every year, roughly 75 to 80% of millionaires in the United States are first generation. They are self-made, not having received an inheritance of their own, but they remain committed to leaving one for their children. But consider for a second, how is that possible? Not only is that number shockingly high, 80%, but how can it remain that high year after year after year after year? They've done the same study since 1996, and every year it reports just about the same number. Well, the answer is that for most first-generation millionaires, 70% of their immediate inheritors squander this generational wealth. And in 90% of circumstances, it's gone by the subsequent generation. Which is to say that after a lifetime of hard work, frugality, wisdom, and not an inconsiderable amount of luck, their children and grandchildren will quickly and consistently burn through that inheritance 90% of the time. Many of us here, many of us here, I think, can resonate with Keheleth's concerns about what his successors will make of the legacy that he has worked so hard to build and now is leaving them. Now, going beyond the individual, you, me, our families, We encounter a similar phenomenon in congregational life. When considering local churches that have existed for hundreds of years, and this church is not that far away from our 200th anniversary, we see that each present-day congregation, this group of people gathered here together, we are a successor. We are an inheritor of generations of faithful, whose resources we continue to steward as trustees. And one day, we too will pass along this legacy into new hands, whether as a pastor or layperson. I laugh that Ken brought up Pastor D during our prayers, because I have written right in here that someday soon a picture of my face will hang on that wall out there.
Someday soon.
In the cosmic sense of it. Someday soon, a picture of my face will hang on the wall alongside all of those other preachers, alongside Dee's and Ian Stryker's and Bruce Lamb's and Wendell and Marion, all of them. And when that time comes, there will be someone new to stand in this pulpit, striving with all their might to offer good news in the face of whatever trial and tribulation is happening in the world that day. Someone new will light the candles. Someone new will offer the call to worship. Someone new will pass the plate, read the scriptures, offer prayers, play the organ, make the coffee. It may happen slowly over time as matriarchs and patriarchs of the church move on or move away, and new members join, grow, and step into leadership roles. But one day, and I know many of you have already experienced this in your life, one day you'll wake up and this congregation will have been reconstituted entirely new, with entirely new people. And who knows what they will do with this legacy which we are leaving to them? Will they keep the sanctuary and the memorial lounge the same as we did? Will they share our exact values and beliefs? Will they support the same missions and causes that we find incredibly important today? Will they collect school supplies and toddler clothes? Will they have a mission thrift store? Will they do a food drive? Well, probably not. They'll be responding in their own time to whatever it is that they are being confronted by. So whether it is the first generation millionaire or the faithful congregation of 200 years, this is the paradox of stewardship. But sometimes our anxiety about legacy and trying to make sure everything is preserved in the future precisely the way that we would do it or the way we would want it, well, that actually suggests that we're still thinking like owners instead of trustees, thinking like ones who are in control as opposed to ones who have been entrusted. While Kohelet's vanity of vanities might initially seem depressing, I think it's actually quite liberating if we really stop to think about it. When we stop trying to build permanent earthly monuments to ourselves, we're free to focus on what actually matters, the relationships that are so life-giving, our love for one another, the connection that we have and that we build among one another and with the community. And these are the things that actually characterize the holy community. We can stop trying to control the future and instead offer our successors the gift of freedom in how they will respond to the world they will encounter tomorrow. For surely we in our world are passing away even now. How many bequests and memorial funds do we have that are restricted to causes and ministries that no longer exist? Now, don't mishear me. I remain quite invested in wise financial planning and policy. In our gospel passage, the issue is not that the farmer had a barn. The issue is not that the farmer had a barn. In fact, in the story, he has multiple barns. He had worked hard, planned and planted well, and he was fully prepared for the harvest. He'd done his research. He was prudent and knew how large a storehouse he needed for what the harvest was expected to produce. He was prudent, he knew what he needed, and presumably he knew that it would hold enough to cover over the expenses and needs of his family and the hired hands and his employees for the year. The farmer had calculated how many hectares he needed to farm. He had done the math, and he would surely produce enough. The problem arose when he had a windfall. When suddenly the fields produced far and away more than he had anticipated, far and away more than he knew he needed. Rather than distributing the additional yield to the poor, or giving it up as an offering at the temple, or simply leaving it in the field, instead he said, "Oh, my good fortune, I will pull down my barns," those barns that were already enough. "I will pull down my barns and build larger ones. And there I will store all my grain and goods, and I will say to my soul, 'Soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, be merry.'" Of course, we know how the story ends. That very night he died. Just as our Ecclesiastes passage has modern scholarly support in what I shared with you from The Millionaire Next Door, I would suggest that our gospel parable does as well. In a widely cited 2010 study by Kahneman and Deaton, they found that income up to $75,000 per year was associated with increased happiness. But beyond that point, there was no further noticeable increase in happiness. So hear that again in colloquial language. Between $0 of income a year and $75,000 of income a year, as you make more money, you can be happier. But once you reach more than that, it levels off. Now, with inflation in 2025, that's more like $100,000 a year. Still a substantial amount of money, I know, though perhaps it doesn't go quite as far in Westchester County as elsewhere in the country. And I can't deflate that amount of money back down to 30 CE when Jesus was telling this story, but I like to imagine that the principle remained true even then. There's a certain amount of increasing income that correlates to meaningful increases in happiness as you can improve your food, your living conditions. You can have a larger dowry for your spouse, right? All of these things in the ancient world. But beyond a certain point, we're back to Kohelet's vanity of vanities. You can keep accruing more, but it doesn't make you any happier. And in our gospel story, I think our farmer tripped right over that line from prudent financial planning to a misplaced and perhaps even idolatrous reliance on wealth to provide something that wealth can never actually provide: security and joy. His original barns were just right at that maximal level, but he got a little bit more and just decided to start hoarding a little bit. But here's the difference. The good news that we proclaim, that the people of Christian faith proclaim, is that our security and our joy are not found in wealth. And so it doesn't matter where you are on that spectrum throughout life, that together, at this table, Christ offers us exactly what we need, not in excess to hoard, but everything that we can embrace and hold as a people of faith. It's a grace that's sufficient for today, love enough to share, and the promise that in giving ourselves away, as he did, we can find the abundance that truly satisfies. Wherever we are on our journey through the difficulties of life, the wholeness of our identity, the fullness of a life lived well cannot be found in work. It cannot be found in wealth or even in wisdom, no matter how much I aspire to that. Instead, in this sacrament, we will remember now in the breaking of bread that it is the good life, this holy life. It can only be found in service to others, in generosity and self-sacrifice, and in humility, even unto death, even on a cross. So let us be a prudent people. Let us be faithful in work and service, yet humble enough to hold the gifts of God loosely in our open hands, not to grasp hold of them as zealous owners if we had done it all ourselves, but instead to release the gifts of God back into the arms of the one from whom all blessings flow. May it be so. Amen.